what I read in The Origin of Species, which is a fantastic book to read. I mean, it wasn't an assignment, it was just really fun reading for me. And Darwin was a wonderful writer, which really helps. What he makes very clear in Origin of Species is that there's a competition for each very tiny strata within every environment. So if you eat only seeds, you have to compete with everything else that eats only seeds. So it's very specific in terms of the levels of competition that go on in the natural world. So I was commissioned to write for chamber orchestra, and I thought, well, you could map that onto instruments by thinking of tessitura. So if you had a viola versus a clarinet versus a horn versus a marimba, you know, they all live in that same strata of what their strongest range is and that kind of alto-ness of those instruments. So who would win? Well, and what does winning mean? Who's louder versus who's more agile? You know, those are interesting things to consider. So the piece is a succession of competitive duos where instruments of the same tessitura are kind of battling each other out. And finally, the last battle, if you can call it that, but it just was a way of thinking about the music. The last battle is the strings versus the brass. And of course, you think the brass will be the loudest, but they run out of air. The strings don't run out of air. So it's a kind of counterintuitive ending that the strings get the last word. So setting up these conditions, setting up this way of thinking, got me the structure of the piece. It wasn't that I decided that the strings have to win because I love the string instruments, or that I really had to finish the chord with the piece with a chord on the strings. It was really something that emerged from my process, that actually, by setting up patterned music where there are different gestures with instruments vying against each other, that the brass are just not going to last as long as the strings. So that was the ending that evolved from my Darwin piece. One of the things I've learned about working in Britain is that there's a kind of national pride in sight reading ability over there. And the British are famous for being incredible sight readers. And what this gets you is a fantastic first reading of a piece. And then things can dip a little, and then they get better again. But the thing about working with people who can read like that is you've got to make sure your material is absolutely clear, because it really makes them very angry to be tripped up by something silly that you've done, you know, making a mistake in your manuscript, in your part. So that efficiency, that sense of professionalism, is sort of a sense of pride that this player can look at any number of nested tuplets and any number of, you know, quarter tones and special effects and all sorts of things you can think of, and just look at it and say, okay, and play it. It's wonderfully liberating in some ways, because a lot of new music techniques are expected there that were not so expected when I was a student working in the US. So there's a kind of level of expectation that, yes, oh, you're a composer, you write new music, you can do these things. I found that very liberating. But at the same time, there's the expectation that if you're going to ask me to do this, you better get your point across perfectly. If I'm going to read it perfectly, you have to give me something to read perfectly. So that gave me a sense of a kind of new level of professional standards. And also I was very impressed when I first moved to Britain, because students start working professionally much earlier. So while, you know, composition students in their early 20s in the US were, you know, writing student pieces for student groups, in Britain, they're already expecting to write for professional groups and are already expecting that level of technical ability and professionalism. It's quite intimidating at first. And it really gave me a sense of reality of professional life, because I had just finished my last graduate degree, and I was meeting people a few years younger than me who didn't have as many degrees as I did, who were producing absolutely polished new pieces that were what they did, and they were thoroughly professional. I think in the US we've been catching up the last few years, and there's a sense now that you really want to know who you are and make your way as a composer as soon as you really can. And there are more institutions and competitions and things in place to help you do that. But when I first moved to Britain, I was really amazed at how much it's part of the infrastructure there. I think it has some disadvantages too, because you don't maybe know as much about your own point of view at age 22 as you do at age 32. And I do think a composer's voice needs time. But that level of professionalism in terms of creating legible parts, knowing your notation, getting it across the players clearly and respectfully what you want them to do, and your understanding of their instrument and knowing that they can do the things that you want them to do. Those are all things that every composer needs at any age. Teaching is such an important part of how we start to compose. I don't know how many composers feel like they were taught to compose. I'm not sure it's something that you can teach, at least in the most important context, which is the creative impetus. You can't give that to somebody else. And as I find with lots of students, everybody's got ideas, but it's how you execute them. You know, if you can't bring them to fruition, then you're nowhere. So I think teaching has become more interesting to me as I've done it longer. I've been teaching for about 8 years now, because I'm trying to help students to make their ideas into pieces. And that's a really hard thing to do for the first few hundred times. I mean, it's still hard for all of us starting pieces, even if we have a lot of experience. But I do feel that teaching is important to me in terms of a way to try to get it right, in terms of helping students to realize their ideas, giving them ideas to work with that can become their own, giving them the space to figure that out, and giving them the encouragement without telling them how to do something. So I like to give a rather light touch with my advice when I'm teaching, to give a sense of direction rather than to say this is the way it must go, because I feel that my music belongs to me and students' music has to belong to them. And what is this for if it doesn't feel owned by the person who creates it?